All right, welcome everyone to the Adherent Apologetics show today. Today we are going to be talking about something very exciting, very unique. I've never done anything like this before, and I'm really excited to learn. I am with Vincent Kajuma. We're going to be talking about African countercult apologetics, something you
Yes.
probably haven't heard of if you're from the West like me. So a little bit about Vincent. He serves on the staff at Emmanuel Baptist Church in Nairobi,
Mhm,
Kenya. That's where he's joining me from today. And he's the
mhm.
Kenya coordinator for the Centers for Apologetics Research. And he's a
Yes.
leading apologist in the African countercults movement. So thank you for joining me, Vincent. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Zach. I am doing very well. Very excited to be here with you. We are also forced to be home a lot because of COVID-19. Maybe with a lot more freedom to move than you, but still constrained in many ways. But we thank the Lord and we look forward to the days ahead and pray for wisdom for our leaders to just know how to direct the country to that
Mm,
end. Mm.
amen. It was very wise.
Amen.
Amen. So what's the restrictions like COVID wise with COVID-19 for you in Kenya? Like what can't you do right now that you could normally do in a normal day?
Yeah, so they've done what they're calling a containment, which basically means that you cannot leave the Nairobi metropolitan area and you cannot enter the Nairobi metropolitan area for a period of 60 days now.
Mm,
So we had a 21-day containment, then another 21-day containment, which has just been renewed again. So for about 63 days, people will not be able to come in or get out of Nairobi. Mombasa, which is another town, a well-known coastal town, a tourist destination, where you have the Vasco da Gama pillar. If you've heard of Vasco da Gama, a well-known Portuguese explorer. So you also can't enter or leave Mombasa at the moment.
mm.
Yeah.
Wow. So I think you guys actually might be more restricted than at least I am where I live in the USA. But
Oh, yeah.
so I'm excited for this interview. Before we begin, I just want to say it's a really cool way in how I found you in your ministry. I'm really excited about this because I actually connected with you for the first time with the apologetics March Madness stuff through the tournament last year. I was
That's
like
right.
giving suggestions for who to add, and someone tagged you and Joe Muita Tiagi. I probably butchered that pronunciation.
Mm-hmm,
Lennox
mm-hmm.
Kalhanga and a few other African apologists, and I was introduced to you guys' work, and I'm just like, wow, this is really cool. So grateful for that. I'm excited for this. And do you have any thoughts you want to add before we get going?
Yeah, I think it's a very good project that you have on there. It has also exposed me to friends and people who I did not know about the work that they're doing, who I'm very glad to have known through the little tournament you organized there. And actually, I was surprised to learn that you've been doing that for quite a while now. Yeah, I think it's brilliant.
Well, I appreciate it. God gave me that idea by the grace of God. So,
Mm.
so let's start. Before we get into some of the specifics, can you just talk a little bit about like kind of like who you are, what you do with your apologetics ministry, just kind of like a broad overview for someone who's like this Vincent Kahuma. I've never heard of this guy before. So, just give a
Mm.
broad overview of what you do.
Okay. So, born and raised in Nairobi, I'm a Kenyan by birth. I am involved in apologetics through a ministry called the Center for Apologetics Research, and I am with the African version of that center. So the centers of apologetics research are actually all around the world. We have a center in Hungary, in Russia, in the US, in other parts, and we have one in Africa, which is very well established in East Africa. And so I help to coordinate the arm of that in Kenya. Basically, what we do is what is called countercult apologetics, which I will speak a little bit about later. but we basically seek to equip pastors and Christians to know what the cults believe and to know how to evangelize and reach out to those in the cults. In a nutshell. Yeah, so one of the main things we do actually is not only to introduce people to these cults, but to define what a cult is. So oftentimes for, at least in Kenya, when people hear cults, they think about very extreme groups, you know, people with frocks and hoodies and candles and, you know, tetragrams drawn on the floor. But that's not what you mean when you say cults. We are basically referring to just very average people that look like you and me, that hold on to something they believe is Christianity, but actually denies the essential beliefs of the Christian faith.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So is your ministry focused more towards reaching people in these cults, or is it more focused on defending current believers in Christianity against these cults, or is the emphasis kind of on both for you and your ministry?
We especially lean in on seeking to equip pastors and Christians to answer to the challenge of cults. And we also deal directly with people in the cults, mainly through evangelism and sometimes through debate. But our emphasis is to strengthen and equip believers with these unique skills.
So how do you guys look to do that? Do you do like where you'll have pastors speak? Do you write like books and articles to inform? Like, what does it look like when you're trying to inform these pastors and other Christians about these cults?
Yes. So there are many avenues that God has allowed us to use to equip people. So as I mentioned, first of all, it is just to help people to appreciate the importance of cult, of understanding cults and needing to address that. So oftentimes when we do our trainings, and I'm just about to tell you how we do that, but we're often beginning with a defense of cult apologetics, actually, because most faithful pastors will basically say, you know, my job is to preach the gospel, full stop. But what we are trying to tell them is that when you're preaching the gospel to people, you are preaching to people who already believe something about God, about Christ, about how to be saved. And so you are positively instructing them with the truth, but then you are also confronting and correcting the false beliefs that they already have. So any preaching, any evangelism is in some way cult apologetics. So that's often a thing that we find that we have to do. We have to tell people that you cannot avoid defending the faith because you're not speaking into, tabula rasa, where people believe nothing and you're being the first one to instruct them. So we have done this through conferences. So we are often invited to conferences. We have been in 4 years. God been able to just create a name, and so we are often invited to conferences by students, pastors, and we have had chances then to speak to people through that. We also create material. So we are a research institute, which basically means that we do the work that pastors don't have to do, of going in and studying cults and understanding their beliefs and seeking to either train our people out of that, or at least to inoculate them against that view. So we do the hard work, then we equip pastors through these trainings to to know how to address whatever beliefs their people are already exposed to. So we especially use brochures. Brochures are like leaflets, which we issue to people, so people come to our offices for the brochures, or we make those brochures available online. So we have a brochure addressing Jehovah Witnesses, SDAs, Mormonism, Branhamites, just basically all the relevant cults in our area. We have brochures for most of those that we give to people freely. So that's kind of the content which we use. We also have videos online. Whenever we are called to speak in a place, we'll often try to record that and make that available for more people to be able to access. So we are just trying to get the word there as much as we can in our context in Africa.
So I want to talk a little bit. Obviously, a large part of this interview will be talking about some specific cults that you experienced specifically in Kenya or East Africa. What are some of the biggest cults that you see, groups that are distorting the gospel or some sort of the thing that you guys deal with? What are some of these biggest groups that you experience in Kenya and East Africa?
So I would put three at the top, in no particular order. The Jehovah Witnesses are very many in Kenya, in Africa. I was recently in a country, the south of Africa, called Mozambique, which is not an English-speaking country and has very little exposure to evangelical Christianity. And even there, the Jehovah Witnesses are already there. So there are people who believe themselves to be Christians and deny the deity of Christ, as their first exposure to the Christian faith, so-called. So the witnesses are many here. The Mormons are also establishing a presence here. They already have plans to build one of their temples in Nairobi, actually. So they see it as a significant hub of just Mormon missionary work in Africa. And then we have a cluster of cults, or a cluster of cultic groups that we call Africa Integrated Churches, which are basically groups of churches that have found a way to mix the Christian faith with African traditional spiritualism, or whatever religion that was there before the missionary introduction of the Christian faith. So the people who have mixed those and kind of come up with this hybrid Christianity, which is also popular in Kenya and in Africa at large. So that's another thing. That's another group I would mention is huge in Kenya.
So, in a broad sense, before we get into some of these specifics of these cults, how do you? I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but when you try to reach these cults, what are kind of some of the general principles that you focus on when you're trying to inform other people and to engage with these cults?
So our aim is evangelism. So we are focusing on Christians, and our reason for focusing on Christians is that we are not out to tell them that, hey, there are these people and they are wrong and we are right, full stop. Our aim is to draw in people. And that's why I began by saying that we inform people that as a Christian, as an evangelist, you are always doing a certain form of apologetics in your ministry. So we are seeking to equip you by helping you anticipate what the person that you're meeting most likely believes. Yeah. So evangelism is a crucial part of our ministry. We are seeking to equip the Christian to be able to evangelize in an effective way, so that if you're speaking about God, and you say God is holy, you will find a lot of agreement with that. But depending on whoever you are speaking to, you might well be referring to a very different entity when you speak about God. So in Kenya, for instance, you find that various regions of the country, which are generally occupied by various tribes, would kind of tend towards a certain understanding based on whatever missionary influence was there before, or based on how strong that cultural influence is in that area. So in central Kenya, where I am right now, generally where Nairobi is, there's a group called the Akorino. This is a group of people who have been just very much influenced by the traditional understanding before being exposed to the God of the Bible, of who God is. And there's a kind of a mixing of um, uh, uh, just cultic, really, practices, sacrificing animals, and certain chants and ways of worship, and those have been mixed. And so you find that when I'm in a place and I'm speaking about God or I'm preaching, I often find that we assume a lot of agreement until we get to the nitty-gritties. Yeah. So the point of all that is to say that intelligent evangelism that genuinely seeks to present the gospel in a way that is not misunderstood must bring in, or rather must factor in the emphasis that we are bringing in as ACFA. So evangelism is an important thing. Then the other thing we do is the defense of the faith. So what exactly we mean by that is that we are helping these Christians to not just understand what, say, Mormons believe or Jehovah's Witnesses believe, but how to speak to them and evangelize them in a way that is clear, is compelling, and is compassionate. Because you are not out to win an argument on religion, you are out to win this person to the truth.
Yeah.
You're out for their faith. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. One question here before we talk about the specific cults is, I'm curious, do you, in your experience in apologetics in East Africa, do you have to deal with reaching atheists as well? I know that obviously in the United States and in the West, we have a lot more atheists statistically, and that's one of the biggest we're trying to reach in the Western world is atheists. So do you have atheists? I mean, I'm sure there's some atheists, but do you have regular encounters, or is there atheist groups in Kenya, like anything among those lines?
Oh yeah, the enemy has not spared us of that. So depending on where you live, so those who live in cities are especially yeah, you are more likely to meet an atheist in the city than in the countryside. So we actually have an atheist association in Kenya that is fairly prominent and acknowledged. Their chairman has had a number of interviews on national TV, in the last 5 years or so. And there's actually a good group of people who profess themselves to be atheists. There are various factors that have led to the growth of that. I think that the internet has had its effect on us. So people are basically introduced to the idea that you could actually deny the existence of God and seek to find a way to explain the things that you thought explain the existence of God. So there's a large number of people who are like that. I engage on my WhatsApp, which is the African, which is very common in Africa and in Kenya. But I engage with a lot of people who, so some are just atheists who are outright and are attacking the faith, and some are just sincere friends who are beginning to struggle with just the veracity of the claims of the Christian faith. But it's actually more than we wish to acknowledge, and it is an area that ACFA, the Africa Center for Apologetics Research, is having to look into right now and try to publish material on that. Yeah, I think that the church in Africa is basically playing catch up on that, because for a long time the idea has been that the Christian faith is about faith. So this is not about thought, this is not about reason, this is about faith. You simply close your eyes and take a leap. And many people of my generation have been brought up with that kind of faith, so that when they began to ask intelligent questions, there were no intelligent answers for them. And they ended up believing that actually my questions cannot be answered by Christianity. And so they jumped ship. Yeah, so, oh yeah, it's definitely here with us.
Yeah, I think it's all around the world now. So I'd love to talk with you about some of these cults that you experience on a regular basis. We'll start off with a couple that probably are definitely known in the United States as well, and then we'll transition to some that are unique to you guys in East Africa. So let's just start off with a couple of general ones that we see all throughout the world. You touched on both of these actually earlier when I was talking to you about some of the leading cults in East Africa. And the first one I want to talk to you about a little bit is Mormonism. Like, so my two questions here. First, like, what does Mormonism look like in East Africa where you're ministering? And then how do you guys look to reach Mormons or educate people about Mormons in East Africa?
Okay. So Mormonism in Kenya, at least, is not very well understood. So people see the compounds of a Mormon church, and of course, at least in Nairobi, they've gotten land and built structures in very prominent parts of the city where we live. So people will often see a beautifully done compound, very well manicured lawns, very just majestic structure. And there are people who think, that's a place where the devil is worshipped. And there are people who basically have not given much thought to it. They just chose to live and let live. But then there are people who have actually converted to Mormonism in Kenya. So what the Mormons have tended to do is to try to get converts from amongst, let's say, the people who are people who have a lot of visibility. And I think it's a strategy that they've used all around the world. But you'll often find a prominent person, usually a news reporter, who will just be a Mormon, but then someone who's respected in the society. So with the respect that this person receives, Mormonism then gets to share the same respect. But to my knowledge, they've not kind of tended to just be evangelistic to the people in the communities where they live. Even though of late, I'm beginning to see a lot more Mormons doing gate-to-gate evangelism than I've seen before.
So how do you guys look to reach Mormons and educate people about Mormonism in with your group, the Apologetics Research Center?
Mm. We produce material that we try to make this simple, but still not simplistic. But we try to summarize and present to people the essentials of the Mormon beliefs. And what we first of all have to do before that is to convince people that Mormonism is actually a true threat to the Christian understanding of who God is, who Christ is, what salvation is all about. So once we, as it were, create the need by informing guys of how prevalent this movement is and how near to your church and to your friends and to your family it is, then we present them with the material that they can use to understand Mormonism and to know how to engage with a Mormon. Um, Obviously, we also inform people that whenever you meet a person who believes something different, say you meet a Mormon in this case, don't assume that he is a Mormon apologist who knows each and every tenet of his religion. There are times that you could tell them things that are very central to Mormonism, and they would go like, I don't believe that, you know? So you want to find out what the person in front of you believes, and you want to talk to them on those terms, you know, and that is far more winsome than getting them to feel accused because you just told them a long list of things they believe, some of which they've just never heard.
So,
Yeah.
last question here about Mormonism. If you could just give a couple of tips or some advice for a Christian who who a Mormon comes to them trying to spread their Mormon faith with this Christian, what are some, like, what's a general guideline or tips that you could give for this Christian interacting with a Mormon?
Okay. So, as I said earlier, first of all, seek. You need to plan to play the long game. It is not common, though it happens, that with one sitting you are going to dislodge this person from something they've believed for a long time. So you need to play the long game and hopefully create a kind of a environment of discussion that would encourage further discussion with the person. So just seek to have the conversation happening in the context of a relationship. But then number two, as you seek to share the gospel with the person, have at the back of your mind these distinctive beliefs of Mormonism. So just do a bit of research, go to our website, acfa.org. We have just accessible materials that you could use to just have at your fingertips what this person probably believes. But as I said earlier, don't expect that the person in front of you believes everything that their sect or their cult believes. Now, in speaking with them, because you have his beliefs at the back of your mind, you are going to be aware then that when you speak about God, you are speaking about the immortal, eternal, self-existing being who has always been God. You are not speaking about a God. You are not speaking about one who was formerly like you, who has his own people. You know, as the person you are speaking to might understand God. Or when you speak about Jesus as our brother, you want to realize that what you understand by that is that he is he is God who took upon himself flesh and became one of us, so that he could be a faithful priest, so that he could own our nature and die for us and live for us and redeem our humanity. But then the person in front of you will basically be seeing a normal, faithful human being exalted, to a state of deity. So you want to be conscious of those words which you might share, which actually communicate very different concepts. So what we tell people is that our training to you, when we tell you what this cult believes, you are meant to use those as tools that are going to inform your natural evangelism. So you are going to come to them as an informed person, but you're not going to slam them on the head with all the doctrines that you think they already believe.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that the now late Ravi Zacharias did very well. Is he used apologetics as a tool for evangelism. He was primarily an evangelist, but he used apologetics, and I think that's what made him very effective.
Oh, he was a great man. Really, really helped me in my own faith at some point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, including myself, could say the same thing. So another one of those these cults I want to look at, one more general one before we get into some more unique stuff, is the Jehovah's Witnesses. So kind of the same thing. Could you talk a little bit about like what being a Jehovah's Witness looks like in Kenya and East Africa, and then how do you guys look to reach Jehovah's Witnesses in your apologetics efforts?
Okay. So I live in a town on the western part of Nairobi. And on a Saturday in the town where I live, it's called Kikuyu, you will see a number of people, about 10, who will come in, and oftentimes they'll be in pairs, either two ladies or two men, or a man and a woman, who's often a husband and a wife. And the men will be wearing shirts and formal trousers, and the women will have a hat on. And they'll basically divide the area amongst themselves. And this group will go here, this group will go here, and they very systematically seek to evangelize the area where I live. I have had a man and his wife come to my home, and we have become friends, though we are not very much in touch now. But they are a very visible group. And when they speak to people, one thing that is very attractive to people is that these evangelists seem to know their Bible a lot. So they'll come to you, and they'll one day decide to speak about angels, or they'll begin to speak about hell, or speak about the atonement or the name of God. And whenever they speak to people are amazed by just how well these guys seem to know their Bible. Now, they are very shrewd. They will not pull out their New World Translation. They'll ask you to use your own Bible. And they've been well drilled and well trained. And they'll basically seek, for instance, to convince you that there's no hell, or there's no heaven that people go to, or that Jesus is not really God. So people then are very vulnerable to these teachings, because when someone comes to you, asks you to open your own Bible, and seeks to convince you from your own Bible that the Trinity does not exist, it is surprising, but then the person has caused you to question something that you just believed lightly. You had never given too much thought about it. And the environment in Kenya is especially fertile for Jehovah's Witnesses to thrive, because they are very close to just the external appearance of what the Christian faith is. And they are also meeting Christians who have not been trained up in sound doctrine. So in Kenya, in Africa, sadly, the word of faith has dug its roots deep in our land, and the word of faith is not strong in teaching doctrine. People are basically taught how to have, enough faith to trust that you're going to get a better job, to trust that you're going to move into a bigger house, to trust that you're going to get your first car or get a better car. And so people are not, trained in who Christ is, what the Trinity is, what the church is, what the atonement is, so that when a witness comes and supplies for you theology that you lack, then you just embrace it. So they're actually growing a lot for that reason. They are meeting people who are not trained in theology at all. So we are especially needing pastors to embrace the need for teaching theology.
Yeah, I think the same thing could be said here. With a lot of people not receiving theological training, talking about having faith, but they don't really know what that faith means, understanding core tenets of doctrine of Christianity. Like I want to back here is Introduction to Christian Doctrine by Miller J. Erickson. And most Christians, I think, probably haven't read some sort of book that gives a comprehensive guide to theology for Christians. I think it's a sad thing to see, and I'm encouraged by people like you who are working to change that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it actually leaves our people vulnerable to false teaching.
Yeah, totally.
In my Christian life, the first time that I had a person teaching a single verse and explaining it and expounding it and weighing the meaning of each word, it was actually a false teacher. And whatever he was saying sounded wrong, but then it sounded like he so thorough, it's like he had worked to get to that meaning. So it left me with a bit of conflict. This doesn't sound right, but then this is so intellectually appealing because of the process through which he has mined it from the verse. And I thank God for preserving me, from embracing that false teacher. But just to tell you that when our people are not trained in doctrine, our people are vulnerable to false doctrine.
Yeah, I was thinking of, and it's either First or Second Timothy, where Paul tells Timothy to first cling on to the faith, and then he says to destroy false doctrine and don't take it lightly. And I think that's something Christians take false doctrine very lightly a lot of the times. So,
one
more question about Jehovah's Witnesses. So, what are some like general guidelines, tips for Christians with engaging with a Jehovah's Witness?
Okay. Some essential things, some topics that I would advise a Christian to touch upon is begin with the deity of Christ. Begin with the deity of Christ. That's so crucial to them. Now, remember that they don't embrace the Trinity. So if you so they will think that the deity of Christ is a priori false because there can only be one person who is God. Yeah, and by that I mean that they will be beginning with the philosophical assumption. I just said a priori, and I want to be understood. They will be beginning with the assumption that Jesus could not possibly be God because that would lead to there being two gods. Yeah. So when they read a text and it seems to imply that Jesus is God, they would ask, how else can I read this so that Jesus does not become God? Yeah. So you want to show you want to show that Jesus is God, but the way in which you do that is actually not to listen to a verse that they give you and hit them with another verse, because then you just begin to trade verses with them. Yeah. So they give you First Timothy, where it says, there's one God, the Father, and you hit them with John 1:1, and then they hit you with another, and you hit them with another. What you want to do is take the verse that they give to you. So there is no verse fairly understood and looked at that is going to deny the deity of Christ. So whatever verse they throw at you, I found this very effective. When they give you a verse, go to that verse, read the verse, seek it out in context, and you actually are going to find that the verse does not support, the non-deity of Christ. So if I can give an illustration, say John 1:1. So if they have their version, it's going to say that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was a God. That's the New World Translation. And that to them, is proof that the Word was not God, the Word was a God. But you can actually use their own Bible and just read on. Without him was not anything made that was made. So if there's nothing that has been made that was not made through Christ, then how can Christ be amongst the things that were made? And so they will answer you that Christ was the first one to be made, and then through him other things were made. But then you see now they will be having to reinterpret and add another word, add another idea to the text before you, or go down to verse 14 all the way to 18 and help them see that no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's bosom or at the Father's side, he has made him known. And you are going to force them to think about the claims that they are making from the text that they are using. And that to me is much more effective than kind of having your bag of verses that you hurl at them and they hurl their verses at you. That does not usually bring much profit. So just as a general method in evangelizing those in the cults, and by the cults, of course, I mean that those who would share the name Christian, but would actually believe a thing that's different from what Orthodox historical Christianity believes. As a general principle, go with them to their best verses and seek to understand the verses with them from an Orthodox perspective. I found that very effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really good principle to kind of look at the verses that they bring out. So now I want to talk a little bit about some cults that are unique or predominantly focused in Africa and East Africa. First thing I was talking to you brought up was African Christianity. So I've like with Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism, like, okay, I know what it is, but this I have literally no, like very like next to no knowledge about what this is.
Oh, yeah?
What you believe. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So could you talk a little bit just about, first off, what is African Christianity? What makes it cultish? And yeah.
So this is actually a movement that is powerful because it is propagated by the intelligentsia, in Africa. It is propagated by professors in Bible schools and just intelligent Africans who are very attracted to it because it seems to affirm what Africans believed. So the general idea is that before the missionaries came, before the gospel was preached to a tribe at the coast of Kenya, hundreds of years ago, the Africans were already worshiping Yahweh. Okay, and the idea is that God was already manifested amongst the Africans, and God was actually saving Africans because an African tribe was no different from the Israelites, so that while the Israelites had their own sacrificial system, Africans had their own. And just as God was at work through through the sacrifices in the tabernacle, God was at work when the Kisi, which is a tribe in Kenya, were offering animals, at the foot of a tree. So all those two are simply different tribes, same God at work in the same way. So there's really no need for an African to have to, walk away from the things that he has believed traditionally when the missionary comes or when the gospel is brought to them. So what they receive from the missionary is just greater light, but a light whose essence the African already has. So it's a question of modifying or adjusting adjusting biblical Christianity to what Africa already has, instead of adjusting what the African or whoever believes to biblical Christianity. Yeah, so it's more like an Africanized Christianity rather than a Christianized, African. This is appealing because of what one would call nationalism. So, I mean, I'm a Kenyan, I'm an African. I enjoy it. It's in my name, it's in my accent, it's in the contours of my face. I'm proud of it. So what that means is that if a brother comes to me and tells me that I have been worshiping idols, I go like, come on, you are attacking the very core of who I am as an, as a Kenyan of this tribe, So whatever you are bringing to me cannot tell me that what I believe is wrong, because it attacks who I am as an African. So if you are to bring me a faith that actually tells me that, hey, Kajuma, you are fine, you just need to top it up with some Bible. Oh, then I'm like, okay, that's bearable, So the more nationalistic I am, I think the more appealing African Christianity is. And that basically what has happened. So when these professors teach this in schools, they will often be people who like to stress the colonial history that happened in many countries in Africa, and so they'll often want to speak about biblical Christianity as a kind of a religious colonialism, where the Africans are being forced to embrace the God of the whites. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you begin to understand how appealing, it is to have this kind of Christianity that rejects the whites and everything about them, but kind of retains some elements of the Christian faith.
Mm. So is African Christianity, this group that you've been talking about, is it almost like a universalistic belief where kind of like everyone is saved, kind of like if you whatever you believe, there's multiple roads to God, and you can be saved through whatever kind of beliefs you have? Is that kind of like a general belief of this group regarding like salvation?
Yes, but then with a bit of a nuance. So in Kenya, for instance, you have various tribes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you 3 tribes. There's a tribe called the Luo. Lupita Nyong'o from Kenya is a Luo. Barack Obama is a Luo. So maybe the Luos are known for that, or rather, you might know that name of the tribe. Then let me give you the Kisi, yeah, who are another tribe, or the Maasai. I think you must have seen pictures of tall men, jumping, with the sunset in the background. Those are the Maasai who jump high with spears. Then you have your Kikuyus, so the current president is a Kikuyu, just to give you some cue, to relate their tribe with. So you have your Maasais, you have your Luos, you have your Kikuyus as tribes in Kenya. And so the god of the Kikuyus has a name, Ngai, and he dwells on Mount Kenya, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And the god of the Luos has a name, Nyasaye, and he dwells, and the sun is his eye, yeah? The sun is the eye of this god. So let me just take these two tribes for now, because the Maasai also have their own god, Enkai, and they have their own theory of who he is and where he lives and how he created and so on. Now, with our understanding, or at least with my understanding, how I've tended to help people to think about it, is that if you claim that Ngai, the Kikuyu god, is the creator god, then you are claiming that Ngai, the Kikuyu god, also created the Maasai and the Luos. If you claim that Nyasaye, the Luo god, is the creator god, then you're also saying that Nyasaye, the Luo god, created the Kikuyu and the Maasai. And therefore, you are necessarily arguing that the Kikuyu need to stop worshiping their god because he's not the creator god, because the God who you are claiming is the creator God does not live on Mount Kenya. You are claiming that the creator God is the one of whom the sun is his eye. So there's there tended to be a very silo type of thinking amongst the tribes, in a way that they even assumed that those around them did not have claims about God that contradicted theirs. So that there was never quite a thought about, is our God the universal God? And does this mean that the white man, for instance, needs to bow the knee to the God who lives on Mount Kenya? That wasn't quite the case. People simply lived in community, had their beliefs, and just didn't think too much about, the universal claims, or rather the universal implications of their local claims. So one way in which we address this as ACFA is just to ask people to consider the universal implications of their tribal claims. So that if I claim that the God who lives on Mount Kenya is God, or if I claim that the God of the Kamba is God, then I am saying that Zach in America needs to bow his knee to the God who created him, who is the God, that my ancestors, poured blood to and understood to be the sun. So when you do that, then you challenge people's thoughts and you invite them to consider the universal claims of the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you make a really good point that most of these religious beliefs that we see throughout the world are self-contradictory. They can't all be true because they contradict each other in so many cases, like the ones you just brought up. So before we transition to another cult, you brought up a really interesting point that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So obviously, a good part of the reason for the spread of Christianity throughout Africa was probably the colonizing of Africa throughout. So how do you respond to people who would say that you're just a Christian because Christians came and colonized your lands, and that's why you're a Christian, Vincent? It's because those people colonized you. And I'm sure you've probably heard something similar to that before.
Oh, yes, I have many times.
Claim? Mm-hmm.
Ask the question again.
So how do you respond to someone who would say that you, Vincent, you're just a Christian because someone came and who was a Christian and colonized you and converted your ancestors, and then you're just a Christian because it goes down your family line, basically through originally sourcing at the colonization of your country.
Oh yeah, it's an easy claim to make. We are Christians because the white man brought it to us, and some people are accused of having sold out their African identity to, Western thought. Mm-hmm. So, I am arguing, making philosophical arguments, and those are understood to be Western, and not African. And some would basically say, you are just a Christian because of these historical reasons. Now, I think those historical and circumstantial reasons need not to be denied. I think it is true that my Western type education kind of just sets me up to really appreciate, the form of Christianity and the books and the theology and the formulations. I think that is true. It is also true that if we had been colonized, by a communist country, Christianity would not have the kind of roots it has in Kenya right now. So just circumstantially, those things are true. However, we also know that God works through means, and these are providences that God used. We know that what is true for me is just as true for Zach, in the US, because the first 12 and the first 12 who Jesus commissions in Matthew 18, Matthew 28, to go, to the world and to proclaim the gospel. They were not Americans, Mm-hmm. They were not Russians. They were not French. And so the gospel came to Americans and to Europeans and to the French and to the Asians. The gospel came to them at some point in history through the ministry of the 12 and those who preached after the 12 and so on and so forth. And there's a very checkered history, there was war, there was conquest, there was martyrdom, there was trade, there are many circumstantial reasons that led to the spread of the gospel anywhere you go. There are refugees, from Somalia, which borders our country, who have come into the country. And because of their refugee status and being in a country where people are free to be Christians, they've come to hear the gospel and to believe. So their refugee status has been God's means to expose them to the gospel. So I think that while those circumstantial reasons are true, they do not therefore deny the truthfulness of the gospel. And there are also some things that have been said. So there are people who have said, and I especially want to say this, there are people who have said that Africans are more given to stories and are not given to, philosophical arguments. And so if you want to kind of Africanize Christianity, you have to dress it in African clothes, which means you need to use stories and you need to be very basic. But I think that is just plain false. It is just simply false. Christianity exists in all those forms. So you have the book of Genesis that has many stories that one can claim an African will relate with. But you have the book of Romans, which is a very tightly argued book. And so would you be saying that the book of Romans, because it's philosophical, it is not for Africans? So I think there are some kind of arguments that on the surface look good, but I think they fail to consider Christianity in its own right and accept its claims and just take it as it is. And they want biblical Christianity to be changed and adjusted to the people instead of people needing to adjust to biblical Christianity. Now, I'm not denying that I think there are some cultural elements that have come with just the way in which Africans have depended on the West. But I think that you need not throw away what is true, because there are times when people throw away what is fundamental to the Christian faith because they're trying to throw away what is Western about the Christian faith that they have received. So may God give us wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. I think a lot of the time we can conform our Christianity to what we want to believe rather than what God's word in the Bible actually says. And that's something that's very important. So one last kind of cult we'll look at here is Islam. Obviously, Islam's a little bit different than the other groups we kind of looked at today. So I'm curious if you could just start off, what does, because obviously I know in North Africa, Islam is the dominant religion by far in countries like Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and Algeria. But what does Islam look like in kind of like Kenya and East Africa? What do you see?
If you came to Kenya and I took you on a bus ride to my home up country, you will count maybe 50 mosques from Nairobi to where I live, which is about 400 kilometers. I don't know what that translates to miles. But what many Muslims have done is that they are playing the long game, yeah. And they have built mosques in almost every area in the country, so that whereas those mosques might not be occupied with people right now, I think their hope is that in another maybe 30 years time, those mosques will have people. So there's a very strategic, very efficient effort at proselytizing Africans towards towards Islam. So in the city, there are a number of mosques, and you have prominent people in government who are Muslims and who are open about that. And very interesting, actually, because of the just political and leadership gaps that are there in Africa. Some of these are caused by what is called tribalism, you know? So if I can give you an example in the States. So if you have one group of people who tend to be Democrats and another group of people tend to be Republicans, and you have a slot in the High Court that the Democrats want and the Republicans want, then one option to go is to pick a neutral group who are neither Republicans or Democrats to occupy their post, so that everybody loses, and so it's fair by giving this middle person. Now, it appears that the Muslims in Kenya have kind of become that neutral group. So when the country is divided on tribal lines and you have two almost equal groups that are vying for important posts in government, then the Muslims who are not, who tend to be of Kushite or Arabic descent will usually be like a neutral party that is then given these strategic roles in government. So what has happened is that we have just leaders, many of whom are doing a good job in the post that they occupy, but are committed Muslims. And so you find that Islam is just making its steady ascent, as a force to be reckoned with on the religious platform in Kenya. A statistic I read a while back is that we currently have about 10% of the country as Muslim. That's a big number. But yes, there's a steady increase in the number of Muslims in the country, and I think in Africa as well. Judging from my trip to Mozambique end of last year, there's a very strong Muslim presence there as well.
Yeah. So what are some kind of like general guidelines or tips that you found when engaging with Muslims, when trying to share the gospel with Muslims? What are some things that you think are helpful for Christians in engaging with Muslims?
I think the same tips. Seek to love the person. He's not an argument to win. He or she is not an argument to win. They are a person that you want to win to the Lord. You believe that they are in error, and you believe that unless they turn and fall at the feet of Christ, unless they accept him as king and priest, unless they trust fully on the blood that he shed, and the death that he died and his resurrection, they cannot be saved. So you have that in mind, and that leads you to try to be compassionate, try to gain their ear. So what you want to do is gain their trust, gain their hearts, so that you can also gain their minds. So Muslim evangelism is especially it especially requires a relationship, so that you can present to them the claims of the faith. Now, one area that I've found effective in Muslim evangelism is the area of assurance. Yeah. So for many Muslims, there's a desire for assurance, but then it is not possible to gain assurance, because you will enter heaven if Allah wills. So you could live, as faithfully as you want to, but you can only hope that you will enter heaven. And they have a very strong view of the sovereignty of God, but then it's the kind of sovereignty that does not involve a relationship and covenant commitment to the people over whom God is God. So I think to inform them and to paint to them our faith as a faith of a God who comes into covenant with his people, with those who trust in him, and he guarantees their salvation, so that Paul can say that I am sure that the God who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Jesus Christ. Statements like those are very jarring to the Islamic hyper sovereignty view. So things like that, things like the love of Christ, the compassion of Christ, the fact that Christ is a holy God who actually draws towards the rebellious sinner so that he can save them, is also a very strange concept in the Islamic paradigm of things. And I think those concepts of compassion, of love, commitment, they especially tend to catch the attention of Muslims. I would say avoid debates. Muslims believe that they understand Christianity. So oftentimes, when you walk in a street in Nairobi, especially in the areas where there are a lot of Muslims, you will see like a large group of people crowded in an area. Then in the middle, you'll see a man in a frock seated on a stool with a Quran in his hand. And then you'll usually find just a person dressed like you and I seated opposite him, and they'd be having a debate. And what this man who's holding the Quran is doing is that he's challenging this Christian from the street and seeking to show this Christian the holes in the Christian faith so that they could submit and become a Muslim. And submit is a interesting word because Islam is submission. Yeah. So there's just this understanding that Islam is intellectually superior to Christianity, and most Muslims believe that. So you'll find, they have a collection of errors in the Bible, and I found it useful again to actually address those errors. If you're involved in an apologetic conversation with them, but ultimately your aim is not to prove them wrong. Your aim is to introduce them to the Savior, to the only one who died so that they as well could be saved.
Yeah, that's so good. And it brings me back again to Ravi and everything that he did through his ministry. And I think the point you brought up about eternal security and assurance of salvation regarding Muslims is really an interesting point, because I remember a few years ago I was working on a project for high school, and I went to our local mosque to talk to a Muslim imam, and I asked him that question about how can you know you are saved? How are you saved? And he kind of described it as you can't know. He said if 51% of your works are good, then you'll be saved. But if you have like 49.99% infinity, you're not going to be saved. And it's like it's such a troubling thing to me, and it's sad that people believe that, like, because like if I believe that's how I'd be saved, I'd just be worried all the time about trying to do everything perfect.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for a savior who we don't have to be perfect for. So we amazing God. So a couple questions here as we start to wrap things up. Just in like a broad sense, if you could just give me maybe like 2 or 3 minutes of why be a Christian, why believe Christianity is true. There's so many religions out in the world. So just in a couple of minutes, can you talk about why should someone be a Christian?
You should be a Christian because it is true. You should be a Christian because Christianity is true. That means that any other thing that you could become is a lie, and there is no no hope in it, no salvation in it, no rest in it, and there is no life in it. Christianity is true, and the claims of Christianity are unique claims. They are claims that God, the self-sufficient God, who is not created, who is the creator of all, who is your creator, has revealed. He has revealed that you are a sinner. He has revealed that you are made in his image. In fact, he has, because you're made in his image, your peace, your wholeness as a human being is dependent on your relationship with him, because you are formed after him. You are a being with a mind, with a soul, with a capacity to worship, to believe, to love, to know God and be known by God. And as long as you are away from God, you cannot realize those things. And especially, there's the aspect that you have broken the law of God. God has made you with a conscience. Part of your bearing the image of God is that you know right from wrong, and you know that there is there is a punishment. There's a just response that a good God must give towards sin. And God reveals to us not just that we have sinned, but that there is great guilt that comes alongside our sinning against God. And by guilt, I don't mean a bad feeling, but there is a weight, there is restitution to be made. There is something to be paid for your sin. And God also reveals that He has given His Son. He Himself, in the person of His Son, has come. God has walked this earth. God has sought to bridge the distance between you and Him, between us as human beings and Him, by doing what it takes, by taking upon Himself the guilt that we have and receiving the weight, the penalty, the justice that is due for our sin, and exhausting it, taking it all upon Himself completely. Jesus died for our sin, and Jesus was raised to prove that He had fully paid for our sin. Now we can only share in the freedom from sin that Jesus acquired by trusting in Him. So you want to accept Christ because of your guilt. You want to accept Christ because it is true. You want to accept Christ because He is your King. You have made a shipwreck of your life. For as long as you remain the captain of the plane that is your life, you yourself would bear witness that you have brought upon yourself much sorrow. And Christ then, offering you joy, asks you to let Him be your leader, let Him be your guide, let Him be your King, let Him rule you according to His Holy Spirit and according to His word. To me, the most appealing thing is just that aspect of the image of God restored to us. I can be a better human being by being a Christian, having the image of God restored in me as I look more and more like God, more and more like Christ. I become more and more human. Anything else is just a distortion of it. Those who are struggling with their faith, for instance, they realize that they don't think they are better people for walking away from the Christian faith. So become a Christian because it is true. And I'm daily just unpacking layers and layers of that truth, and I'm actually seeing that whatever errors are there in my mind are actually being corrected. The more I learn about God, the more I see His word. There is truth for me, there is wonder for me, and there's relationship for me, and I could go on.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way of sharing the gospel. I have one more question for you, and then we'll have one more question from the audience, and then we will start to wrap things up here. My last question for you is: how can myself as a Christian in the West, how can other Christians in the West who are listening to this, how can we assist you guys in East Africa with your ministry? What can we be doing to uplift you or provide more resources to help you? How can we help you further your ministry and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I am glad you asked, brother. There are mainly three ways that you could assist us. Please pray for God's direction for us as a ministry. Pray for God's provision for us. We need the prayers of the saints all around the world. There can be no success, apart from God being at work. We do not want a kingdom built with the hands of man. We want a kingdom, a temple that has been made with the very hands of God. So we need prayers. If you want to just keep current with what we are doing and know how to pray in specific ways, you can follow us on social media. Links that will be shared later, just help you know how to pray for us as a ministry. We are currently in Uganda, in Kenya, and in Zambia, and all our men in those areas are tempted to be discouraged because we are few and the work is great. So we especially need your prayerful support. We also would ask you to refer Christians in Africa to the resources that we have made, and share those freely. So you could help us even though you are not with us here, by just pointing people to the material that we have made, and having a hand then, and being able to participate in those ways. Share our videos, but just increase for us the visibility, because our material can go to places where we will never step foot. And then lastly, we obviously need financial support for the work that we do. Consider supporting us via the Center for Apologetics Research in the US. So just go to the centers, yes, the thecenters.org, thecenters.org, and you will find ways in which you can give. So we have our executive director in the US, and he is just a great man. He's just a great man. He's a student, or let me say he worked with Walter Martin. Walter Martin is a very well-known cult apologist who wrote a book called The Kingdom of the Cults. Hank Hanegraaff was also a student of Walter Martin, though he has since become Eastern Orthodox, and Paul Carden was part of that group. So he's been doing this now for maybe 40 years. He's based in California, and your giving would get to us, of course, through just the financial infrastructure in the US. So please feel free to do that. There are men who love the work, who are working hard, who are worth your prayers, your sharing their material, and your financial support.
So one question here from the live viewership, and then we'll start to wrap things up as we approach the end of our time. From LJ Gold, how is it? I believe I pronounced that right. How are you doing? I'm glad you joined us today. He says, how can this outreach be replicated in Nigeria? Well done for the good job. So do you have any thoughts on this question?
Oh, yes. I would request him to write to me. So just send me a direct message on Twitter, and I would love to get in touch with him, and we can think together on practical ways in which we can answer the unique needs in Nigeria. I think there are already men there who are doing similar work. I know of a brother called Femi. I forget his second name. Femi Osunuyi, who is just a brilliant and just able preacher of the gospel, who I think his church would have would be conscious of the apologetic needs in Nigeria. So I would urge him to just write to me, and I'll first of all help him to get in touch with guys in Nigeria who are like-minded, but then we can also think about ways in which we can share resources and advice and just counsel with him in Nigeria. Thank you for writing. Okay? It's good to hear from someone from Nigeria.
Is it okay if I put your email in the chat? Because I think there's a chance your Twitter messaging is actually only for people that you follow. Because I couldn't message you on Twitter, I think. So is it okay if I just share your email in the video?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is perfectly fine.
All right, I just wanted to make sure it's in the chat now. If you want to get in contact with Vincent,
yes.
Has been a really amazing interview. I feel inspired and encouraged by people like you doing God's workplace where apologetics is really needed. So I really appreciate your time. I thank you for everything you've done. And I look forward to seeing what's in the future for you. Is there anything else you want to say in terms of how to follow you or any closing thoughts before we wrap things up here?
Yeah, I would just want to encourage believers, especially at this time, that many people are maybe not thinking that there's light ahead, simply because we have had our heads immersed under the water for so long now because of COVID-19. And number one, let us thank God, as things begin to ease and we might be getting chances to gather sons of God's again in our churches. But number two, let us just remember that things like COVID happen because the world is a broken place. There is better news than just a world like this, a world that is one day away from shutting down. There's better news than living in a world like that, and God is preparing His people for a new world. That a day is coming when He will refurbish and make new this world, and when He shall dwell with His people, a world that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, where sin or the effects of sin will never come in. So I would just invite those who are believers to rest even more in Christ, set their hope fully on the grace that God will reveal to them soon when Jesus is revealed. Set your hope fully on that. And those who are not in Christ to consider the claims of the Christian faith. And even those who are doubting if they should, I tell you, you do not walk away from such a great salvation. Christianity is true, but I pray that you will be a sincere seeker, and you will find it to be true.
Man,
Yeah.
this was just an amazing interview. I really appreciate your time. I've come away inspired. I know a lot of people were commenting the same thing. Appreciate you for your time. I encourage everyone, follow Vincent Kajuma on Kajuma, is that how you pronounce your last name?
Kajuma.
Kajuma. Oh, I've been
Kajuma, yeah.
Thank you, Vincent, for your time. You can follow Vincent. You can follow his apologetics ministry. All the links are in the description if you are with us on YouTube. And I thank everyone for your time. If you enjoyed apologetics, you can follow. After you follow Vincent, if you have not, you can go follow us at AA Apologetics on Twitter. And you can search for Adherent Apologetics on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now, all that stuff. But make sure you follow Vincent first, and then you can come follow me. After you support Vincent in his ministry, you can consider supporting Adherent Apologetics, as we're trying to reach part-time funding. We're about a couple $100s away, so any bit helps. But appreciate you guys' time. Patreon.com/Adherent Apologetics. Vincent, I thank you so much for your time. This was an amazing and inspiring interview. Yeah, I just appreciate you, man. It was awesome.
Thank you, brother. It has been awesome to spend time with you as well. Very encouraged by you, man.
Appreciate it. Same can be said to you. All right, everyone. Thank you for your time.